Welcome to Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind, a true crime podcast. This is Dominika Best, your host. I have always been interested in the mind and how we and our personalities can explode, damage, hurt, and even kill the people around us. It's why I've been an avid crime fiction reader all of my life, and now I'm a crime fiction author myself. True crime has always been the basis for so much of crime fiction because many times true events are incredibly insightful and also stranger than fiction. I'm not a therapist, but I do create characters for a living. I'm constantly digging deeper into what makes a person, how does their psychology drive their actions, and how do they affect the people around them. Why did they do what they did? These stories are integral to my fiction, and I'm looking forward to delving into the cases with you. Welcome to The Deviant Mind. This episode is not appropriate for all listeners. All of the research I've done will be in the show notes on my website, but they include The Lost Girls, an Unsolved American Mystery by Robert Kolker, which is a book, the documentary The Killing Season on Discovery Plus, various news articles listed in the show notes, as I've said before, and this episode really draws heavily from news articles and court documents because Robert Kolker's book didn't go deeply into these women or, of course, the subsequent men who were suspects. Some of them were, but not all of them. And if you haven't read the book yet, please go do so. And there is a Netflix show that is called Lost Girls as well that was based on that book. In this final episode, I'm going to touch on the remains found in 2011 and who has been identified so far. This includes Jessica Taylor, whose partial remains were found at Gilgo Beach, Valerie Mack, Baby Doe, who was a 16 to 24-month-old daughter of Jane Doe No. 3, who is also known as Peaches because of her tattoo. Her were also found, they had partial remains, near Jones Beach State Park. In December of 2016, tests proved that Jane Doe No. 3 was in fact the same person as Peaches, but that's as far as identification has gotten for both her and her daughter. The Asian man has not been identified yet either. And again, thank you so very much for sticking with me. I know I haven't put out an episode in 2 weeks with Thanksgiving and sickness hitting my house. It's been a little bit difficult, but I am moving forward in trying to publish an episode weekly. So thank you again for listening. So first, I'm going to talk about Jessica Taylor and her case. Parts of her body, mainly her torso, were found years before Shannan Gilbert's disappearance and the subsequent grisly discovery of bodies. On July 26, 2003, a dog walker discovered a naked torso lying on top of a pile of wood and sticks on the to make identification harder by trying to obliterate a tattoo that Jessica Taylor had on her back. He also removed her head and her hands. So, how was she, in fact, ID'd? Well, the medical examiner's office managed to piece together the tattoo and released photos of it to different agencies. A detective in Washington, D.C. was working Jessica Taylor's missing person case and saw the tattoo and was able to identify her. The tattoo was a red heart with angel wings with Remy's Angel written across it. On March 29, 2011, investigators found a skull and two hands roughly a mile from where the Gilgo 4 were found, and the DNA working around the Port Authority bus terminal in Manhattan between July 18th and July 22nd. And now this was, again, going back to 2003. It has been hard finding out about Jessica Taylor's life online. From a Newsday's article, dated May 10th, 2011, I was able to find out that she was from a small town in upstate New York and that she was estranged from her family. She'd worked as a sex worker up and down the East Coast, including Washington, Atlantic City, and New York City. She'd been arrested in all of those cities. During one of her bookings, she assaulted a police aide and punched her in the face and pleaded guilty to that. She was also arrested for larceny when she was pulled over driving a stolen Chevy Cavalier in Brooklyn. Police records indicate that's where she lived at the time. She was sent to Rikers on February 25, 2003, and was discharged on April 28, 2003. Jessica went down to Washington, where one of her friends, another sex worker, reported her missing in mid-July. Unfortunately, I couldn't find an obit or anything else about her life previous to her arrest records, and when I was reading about her in all of the different newspapers, this is pretty much all they had on her, was that she had been a sex worker with multiple arrests and that she had disappeared. And no family has really posted on the Facebook pages of the other women. It was just really sad not to be able to find out more about who she really was. The other victim that was identified was a woman named Valerie Mack, and her identification just happened a couple years ago. On May 28, 2020, forensic genealogy positively identified the remains of the Manorville torso, which is what she was called, and the partial remains found in 2011. They had finally found Valerie Mack. Valerie Mack had disappeared around October. Her mother, Patricia, had serious substance abuse problems and had contracted AIDS. Valerie had 4 older siblings, and all of them were placed in foster care after a long and contentious divorce between the mother and her recent husband. Valerie was in and out of various foster homes until she was 8 years old. Edwin and Joanna Mack wanted to adopt another child, and when they found out about Valerie through a couple at church, they got along well with her and they brought her into their home. Edwin Mack said she had a sweetness about her, and her adoptive mother, Joanne, was quoted as saying, this was a quote from her, she was a wonderful girl, quick sense of humor, and vivacious. Her sister, Danielle Wade, who was adopted after Valerie, is also quoted as saying, quote, "The thing I remember about her the most was how fiercely protective and nurturing she was towards those she cared about. I looked up to her, and she was the coolest person on the planet to my little kid mind." Valerie, at first, seemed to thrive with her idyllic setting in New Jersey. She loved doing youth plays at the Green Tree Church in Egg Harbor. She was doing well in school, and one of her prized possessions was an upright piano. However, something happened to her in the 9th grade at the age of 14. And of course, going through all of these articles, nobody ever talked about what did happen to her, but it completely changed the course of her life. Her demeanor changed. She started hating school. Her family sought counseling at a New Jersey crisis center, but because she was 17, the state social service system said she could be treated as an adult who could make her own decisions and didn't really help the parents out. Valerie moved in with a half-sister to Wildwood, New Jersey. She gave birth to son Benjamin in 1994 and moved in with her son's father. She didn't stay there long, though, and left Benjamin with his dad, and who ended up having pretty much custody of the child. Her parents said she was going back and forth between Philadelphia and New Jersey, and around this time, Joanne Mack mentioned that when she spoke to her daughter, Valerie was constantly worried that she wasn't a good mother. At this point, she'd assumed an identity by the name of Melissa Taylor, and she was working as a sex worker, both in Philadelphia and Washington. She was arrested 3 times for drugs, prostitution, and loitering. Her parents were extremely worried about her chosen profession as well. In the fall of 1999, Valerie was diagnosed with pericarditis, an inflammation of the outer lining of the heart. She moved back home and seemed to want to turn her life around. She quit drugs, got a job at the Dollar Tree discount store, and was doing well there. However, she was also having premonitions of something bad that was coming for her, and she was scared. She left home to see her son and her half-sister in New Jersey in October of 2000. A quote from the same Newsday article by her mother, Joanne Mack was quoted as saying, quote, "It was at that point that I heard of Valerie going to New York. I never heard of her mention New York at any time." Quote, "When she left that day from her sister's house, she said she was going to New York. She was with a guy, end quote. And then she disappeared. When the Macks didn't hear from her, they went to the local police department to file a missing persons report. But the police said since Valerie was 21 and had a history of running away, they wouldn't take the report, which again is so distressing. So this family did not get any answers until 2020. The Suffolk homicide detectives working with the FBI had submitted Valerie's genetic profile for analysis between 2019 and 2020. And now this was the genetic material that was found from her body, from the Manorville torso, and the pieces that were found of her in 2011. But they didn't submit them until 2019-2020. An FBI special agent who was a trained genealogist uploaded Valerie's profile into a public genetic database. And again, this is the Manorville torso profile that came out with the fact that it was Valerie. So this public genetic database is where people trace lost relatives, and the search began. Valerie's relatives were found, and then Valerie was identified through testing of her son's Benjamin, his DNA. The police were able to give Joanne a ring with a dark heart-shaped onyx that Joanne had given to Valerie years before that had been found on the body. She had died wearing it. So both of these women were also very similar to the Gilgo Four as far as the way they looked, how small they were, and how short they were. And it doesn't take much of a stretch to see that maybe the same killer was responsible for their deaths. All right, so let's talk about the men who have been prime suspects in these murders. As I said before, no one has ever been charged for the LISK murders. So before we get into that, I actually found a New York Times article written by Manny Fernandez and Al Baker that was titled Bright, Careful, and Sadistic, Profiling Long Island's Serial Killer. And they had managed to publish the profile that the FBI had created. So this was what the profile said. He is most likely a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s. He is married or has a girlfriend. He is well-educated and well-spoken. He is financially secure, has a job, and owns an expensive car or truck, and he may have sought treatment at a hospital for poison ivy infection. As part of his job or interests, he has access to or a stockpile of burlap sacks, because as you remember, the Gilgo Four were all found in burlap sacks. He lives or used to live on or near Ocean Parkway on the south shore of Long Island, where the police have found as many as 10 sets of the human remains. So all of the experts that these journalists talked to from the FBI and FBI adjacent said that he was an organized killer, that it took planning to get these women to remote locations and then to dispose of bodies. Some investigators had posited he could have been in law enforcement because he knew how long to stay on the phone with the family members he'd called and taunted to pinpoint his location. He always used Times Square or other crowded sites for the calls. And the authorities would then have issues using surveillance cameras, and they were never able to find anybody on the surveillance cameras. So the first suspect that we had actually talked about in the Lost Girls book was a doctor named Charles Peter Hackett. And he was really the first suspect outside of the John, who I will get to, but he was cleared by the police very quickly. Now, there's a huge community on web sleuths that has really honed in on Peter Hackett because he called Mari Gilbert, Shannon's mom, 2 days after Shannon disappeared and told her he was running a home for wayward girls and that he'd taken Shannon in that night and that she was okay, that he'd given her medication to help her sleep. He then claimed to put her into the car of her driver in the morning. 3 days after that, he called her and denied having any contact with her daughter or that he'd previously called her. The police confirmed that he'd made those 2 calls through his phone records, and he went on the news to admit he'd actually made those calls, which of course was suspicious. So the police went to all his neighbors asking them about the doctor, Peter. There were accounts from the neighbors that Peter had told them that he'd been the last one to see her alive, and that he'd sedated her because she was so upset and she stayed inside his house for some time. He claims he put her in Michael Pack's car. When Robert Kolker talked to many of the neighbors at Oak Beach, they told him a similar story about Peter's recollections of that time. That he found her, sedated her, that she was at his house, and then he packed her into Michael Pack's car. The rumors were flying through the grapevine of Oak Beach regarding him. Many of his neighbors thought that he told stories because he wanted to be a big shot and wanted attention. And so, the police had to take a look at him too. The one person who said he never heard the sedation story was Gus Coletti, who was a dear friend of his. And if you remember from the first episode of Shannon Gilbert's disappearance, he was one of the neighbors that she came knocking on his door on that fateful night. Peter Hackett fits all of the criteria that was given by the FBI profile, except for the poison ivy infection. He lived in Oak Beach and was a neighbor of Joseph Brewer, who was the John that Shannon went to that night. He was a former doctor who worked with Suffolk County as a police surgeon, which means that he knew how to disarticulate or take apart a body. And he was also known around the neighborhood as someone who stretched the truth. He told tall tales and made up heroic actions that were simply not true, because he really liked the attention. But even though the police initially looked at him, they really never found anything. And of course, when Shannon Gilbert's remains were found, they were found behind his house, about a quarter of a mile, with her things. There is that to consider as well, but he seems to have really kind of fallen off the radar in recent years as a prime suspect outside of, like the web sleuth communities. Mari Gilbert, Shannon Gilbert's mom, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Peter Hackett in 2013. John Ray, her attorney, claimed that he gave her drugs that facilitated her death because he called Mary and said that he had given her medication. Hackett, at this point, denied treating Shannon, and the lawsuit was dismissed in 2018. He moved out of Oak Beach soon after all of the bodies were found to Florida and has seemingly kept to himself. He has not talked to the press, even though that they've come calling. He has given a statement about the fact that he did make those 2 phone calls to Mari, and that's pretty much all that he's ever said. So that's him. And I personally think he was probably a man who liked to be in the middle of an important event. And I still can't imagine him calling the mother of a missing woman. Supposedly he got the number from Shannon's boyfriend. But I don't know. He doesn't seem to me like the guy, but that's just my own personal opinion. So the next suspect that was very interesting and seems much closer was a man named John Bitrolf, which I'm probably mispronouncing that. So he is a convicted murderer that on the day of his conviction, the Suffolk County prosecutor, Robert Biancavilla, stated, this was September 12, 2017, that John Bitrolf, a Suffolk County resident convicted in 2014 of murdering 2 sex workers, Rita Tangretti and Colleen McNamee, in 1993 and 1994, had a connection to at least one of the victims of LISK. Now, he was tied to Rita and Colleen through DNA testing of semen found on their bodies. This was another one of those genealogy things where his brother submitted DNA in a conviction in 2013 in a completely different case. And when the brother submitted his DNA, it went into the database and it flagged the fact that it had a familial match to the DNA that was found on Rita and Colleen. He had another brother, so they found a way to get the other brother's DNA, and it wasn't him. And then they ended up following John around, and he was very sketchy. Like, he wouldn't leave his DNA, but they finally went through his garbage and found it. And his DNA was, in fact, a match. And then when they brought him in for questioning, he drank from a coffee cup, and they used that DNA from the coffee cup to positively match him to the DNA found on these 2 women. So Bitrolf was convicted in May of 2017 on these murders, and he received 25 years for each murder. The Suffolk County Police didn't comment on the prosecution's statement, and Bitroff's attorney, of course, denied the allegations, because through this whole thing, John Bitroff said that he was innocent and that there was problems with the DNA, and, well, I'll get into that. But he's still contesting this conviction. So the police also suspect he murdered another woman named Sandra Costilla in November of 1993. And during the trial, Biancavilla claimed that Bitroff hated women and all living creatures. And this was in 2 different New York Post articles, so I'm assuming this must have been part of maybe his closing arguments, that John Bitroff had once wrestled the pig to the ground and slit its throat, and he ripped out the heart of a deer and ate it raw in the woods, which sounds crazy. However, Bitroff was a known and avid hunter. These 3 women were raped, strangled, beaten, and posed in wooded areas that were a couple feet from the road. When an organized killer like this poses their victims to be found, this behavior suggests he wants attention and to play games with authorities. These 3 women were also all petite and stood around 5 feet tall, just like the LISK victims. And both LISK and Bitroff strangled their victims. And he also lived in Manorville, where the torsos of Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack were found. He was a hunter who enjoyed killing animals, like I said before, and was a carpenter by trade, so he had access to hacksaws and electric saws. And since the bodies were expertly dismembered, his knowledge of and access to tools made him look very suspicious. And there was also a phone call to the police about Colleen McNamee. There was an anonymous male caller who pinpointed her location so she could be found, and that caller was never identified. Could it have been him? He also, like the prosecutor had mentioned, had a connection to Melissa Bartholomew by way of Rita Tangretti, who he murdered. Her grown daughter was best friends with Melissa Bartholomew, one of the Gilgo Beach victims, and Melissa's mother said that Melissa had numerous calls to Manorville from her phone before her death. John Bitroff lived within 5 miles on Silas Manor Road from the area where Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor were found, and both torsos were laid out for anyone to find on roads that a hunter would be familiar with. Because of all of this information, John Ray, the lawyer representing the family of Shannon Gilbert, said through all the years of investigation in this case, Bitroff's name never came up for him, and he, John Ray, doesn't believe he's responsible, which was surprising to read for me, because he sounds like a pretty great candidate. So John Bitroff, he pleaded not guilty in this trial and claimed he was innocent of all the killings and was planning to appeal. And then going back to this FBI profile, I mean, he kind of matches it very well. He had been a pillar in the community. He was in his 40s and a family man. He had 2 sons and a wife, and he was very socially adept. And he was 44 years old in 2010. And following his arrest, a reporter asked a neighbor what they thought about him, and the neighbor said, quote, "He's like the mayor of this town. He knows everybody. He helps everybody out," end quote. I went digging into John Bitroff and didn't find that much on newspaper articles, but I did find some Reddit boards on LISK and him. And they stated, and again, I mean, this is, I guess, internet hearsay, but they did say that they had found his records, that he'd been in legal trouble before, that there was a grand larceny charge in 87, an assault charge, and a DUI. And on top of everything else, he built the deck at Gus Coletti's home. And I guess this is an established fact. And Gus Coletti lived in Oak Beach, and he was one of the neighbors that Shannon had come to for help that night. Now, his family and his brother always claimed he was innocent, and his family had stood by him this entire time. And supposedly, in their minds, there were problems with the trial because of evidence. Mr. Key Han, who is the defense attorney for Bitroff, honed in on that evidence was destroyed in both Valerie and Jessica Taylor's cases, and they're still appealing this to this day. Now, DNA results on bodies, especially when there's a match, like that kind of makes me think that he probably definitely killed Rita and Colleen, and supposedly it came up in the trial that they had sex like half an hour before they were killed. And the defense attorney was trying to say that maybe he had the DNA on him, but he didn't kill them. But I think looks like the two were very linked, at least in the jury's mind. He sounds like he had pretty violent tendencies that were hidden from his family. And I don't know, when you hear about a man who has a loving family who's standing behind him, but also was frequenting sex workers and having larceny charges and hurting animals, I guess, from if we're going to listen to the internet hearsay, it does make you think because he has that mask on, which always makes me think that there's something there. And there must have been enough evidence for him to be charged in those two murders, and the fact that the police really think he murdered a third one as well. When I looked and found like what the evidence was, maybe some of the DNA might have been degraded and was thrown out, so they couldn't retest it, but the original DNA was tested. So again, he personally, to me, he looks the best out of all of these men. Going on to the next one, of course, we have to mention Joseph Brewer, who was the John who hired Shannon Gilbert the night she disappeared, and he was a resident of Oak Beach as well. Now, if you remember, he said that Shannon started to act erratically soon after she arrived, and she called 911, and she ran out of the house. He tried to help get her back into the car with Michael Pack, and that was pretty much his involvement. Police cleared him of any wrongdoing in this case, and the police are still saying that Shannon Gilbert is not a confirmed victim of LISK, which, as we've talked about before, the family vehemently disagrees with. So he's pretty much that's been kind of it for him. Like, he brought her there, he tried to get her back into the car, and that was it. I'm assuming, I wonder if he had alibis for some of the murders or if he was, I don't know how they cleared him because I was not able to find that information. Now, there was another man by the name of James Bissett, who was a local wealthy businessman who was a co-owner in a nursery. And he was very wealthy, and he did match the profile somewhat. His big connection to this case was the fact that his company, the nursery, was a major burlap supplier in the area, so he had a lot of burlap bags. Unfortunately, he was found in his car in a parking lot on December 14th, 2011, 2 days after the first body was found. He was 48 at the time, and he committed suicide, and the community kind of whispered about if the timing of his death and the discovery of the bodies could have something to do with it. But that was it. And from everything that I could see, there was never really an investigation on him. It was more of innuendo in this community. So the last big suspect in this case, which kind of goes into kind of the crazy conspiracies that revolve around this, was James Burke. And he was the former Suffolk County police chief. And he allegedly blocked an FBI probe into the LISK case because he was trying to save his own skin. Per a New York Post article, he refused to loop the FBI into the LISK investigation because he learned he was in their crosshairs for assaulting a drug-addicted man named Christopher Loeb. On December 14th, 2012, Loeb was arrested at his mother's home, where authorities found a cache of stolen property, including a duffel bag out of Burke's police car. The Fed documents stated that, quote, the items stolen from Burke's vehicle included his gun belt, magazines of ammunition, a box of cigars, a humidor, and a canvas bag that contained, among other items, sex toys and adult pornography. The feds then allege that when Burke found this out, he raced to Loeb's home, tampered with the crime scene by grabbing the duffel and other belongings, quote, in direct violation of police procedure and protocol, end quote. And per these court documents that I found, Burke forced his lower level cops to get their, quote, stories straight, quote, and keep him out of the case. The New York Post said that he intimidated them so badly, one of them lied under oath. Burke then headed to the station where Loeb was held, and this is another quote from the Fed papers. Loeb was, quote, handcuffed, hunched over, and manacled to the floor, and Burke proceeded to attack this man. The court papers allege that, quote, Burke shook Loeb's head violently, punched him in the head, and attempted to knee Loeb. Since Burke knew that Loeb was a heroin addict, he also threatened him with a deadly hotshot overdose of drugs laced with poison. Loeb, of course, couldn't fight back, but called Burke a pervert for the porn. Burke went out of control and started cussing and hitting the man until his detectives had to tell him to stop. So he did, and then he started, for months after, bragging about what he had done to Loeb, and he called his detectives his palace guards. The LISK case was being actively investigated at this time, and Burke kept the FBI away from this specific investigation from January 2012 to October 2015. He, of course, got caught, and on November 2016, Burke was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison for assault and conspiracy. Now, here are some characters that I talked about in the first episode on this, which was episode 2. So if you guys remember, Thomas Spoda, who was then district attorney in Suffolk County, he was convicted in December 2019 for his part in the conspiracy to cover up Burke's assault. And then another man, Christopher McParland, a Suffolk County top anti-corruption prosecutor, was also convicted. A day after Burke's indictment, Suffolk Police Commissioner Tom Sini said the FBI would take a major role in the Gilgo Beach cold case from now on. Now, did Burke have a personal connection to the Gilgo case? John Ray, Mary Gilbert's lawyer, and a sex worker alleged he did. John Ray alleged that James Burke attended parties with drugs and sex workers in Oak Beach, and a sex worker who identified herself as Leanne claimed she had rough sex, this is in quotes, with Burke. She also said that she had witnessed him grab, and this is a quote, grab a girl by her hair and drag her to the ground, end quote. There's a lot of theories swirling on the internet about this specific conspiracy, and that many people believe that there was a cover-up and that he could be LISK. Now, of course, I see his tendency for violence and what he thinks of drug addicts and sex workers, which is horrifying. But does this make him capable of being a serial killer or just drunk on power? Now, of course, he had pornography in that duffel bag that he tried to move heaven and earth to get back, which supposedly in some other sources said was kind of like fake snuff type of pornography. And there was also Viagra in there. But I just, again, like the cover-up seems so much bigger than what was in there. But maybe he just didn't want to be found out that he was this man, or maybe he was trying to get his gun back. Again, the theories are crazy swirling around this, but I don't know. He does match a lot of the profile, but I'm not really convinced. Even though, the profile did say that it could be somebody in law enforcement, but the police chief, I would think that somebody would have come out and said something about that. So those are pretty much the only suspects that have been uncovered. And as I had mentioned in other episodes, the police have just this year, like 2022, in May, released Shannon Gilbert's 911 call, as well as the footage of another one of the Gilgo Beach 4 victims and I think I mentioned this in the last episode. They're still actively looking for LISK. Even though John Bitroff is in jail, they are still hoping that the public will come out with more information. I wonder if they do know something about maybe John Bitroff, who I personally think is the best kind of candidate from all of these suspects to have murdered all of these people, because it looks like he murdered 3 already. So, I mean, he's already a serial killer, right? By the standard definition of one. So that was the 4-part case of the Long Island serial killer. And it was a long one. And I know it's been unresolved, which is always frustrating. And I do hope that the 911 call in the video will spark somebody's memory and they will come forward, because it's been so long now. And hopefully this killer will be found, because it was pretty awful. Now, I know that there's been some cases in Atlantic City and Florida that were connected to maybe that he was going up and down the coast. That was posed as a theory in The Killing Season, which is the documentary. And, it very well could. You saw the serial killer that the Los Angeles police found, Smalls, he traveled all throughout the country. So that definitely doesn't mean that this one couldn't do it either. But because this place is so remote, I do wonder if it was somebody who actually lived there and still lives there, if it wasn't actually John Bitroff. So that was it. Thank you for joining me on this 4-episode series on the Long Island serial killer. I'm thinking that next week I will do a case that is solved that will only span 1 episode, and we'll go from there. So keep safe, everybody, and I'll talk to you next week. This episode was sponsored by The Creek Killer, Book 1 in the Harriet Harper thriller series written by me, Dominika Best. What would you do if you read The Police Found Your Body in a Creek? Find out in The Creek Killer, available on Amazon. Thank you for joining me and listening to this episode. If you like my show, please give me a rating and review. It helps other listeners find this podcast. Follow Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit thebeststorytellingnetwork.com, where you'll find show notes, my books, links to social media, and much more. Join my Patreon for special subscriber perks, like 2 extra exclusive episodes a month and a Q&A with me at patreon.com/The Deviant Mind Podcast. Until next time.